The shadow in the bayou.
The storm outside was relentless, battering against the frosted windows of the Rusty Anchor, a small tavern perched on the edge of the Mississippi River. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of stale beer. We were a group of 5, huddled around a corner table, trading ghost stories to pass the time. But frankly, they were dull affairs, rehashed legends about hitchhiking phantoms or headless horsemen that everyone had heard 1,000 times. The atmosphere was flat, much like the beer. That was until Elias Thorne walked in. Elias was the local legend of sorts, a retired land surveyor who had spent 40 years mapping the wildest, most unforgiving terrains of the South. He was pushing 70 now, a man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that seemed to look right through you. He was known for 2 things: his encyclopedic knowledge of the occult and his absolute refusal to tolerate fools. When Elias spoke, people listened. He shook off his rain-slicked coat, hung his hat by the door, and limped over to our table. The room went quiet. "Ghost stories, is it?" Elias grunted, pulling up a chair. "I heard bits of it from the door. Kids in sheets, barnyard boogeymen, child's play." One of the younger men, a skeptic named Dawson, smirked. "And I suppose you have something better, Elias? A real monster?" Elias didn't smile. He ordered a bourbon, neat, and leaned forward. The flickering candlelight danced in his pale eyes. "I have a story," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I don't know if it's a ghost story. I don't know what the hell it was, but it happened. And it wasn't in some storybook haunted house. It was deep in the Atchafalaya Basin, back in 28. We leaned in. The wind howled outside, isolating us from the rest of the world. I was a young man then," Elias began, staring into his glass. "The lumber company sent me down to a place called Blackwood Creek. My family was back in New Orleans, and I was sent ahead to scout the timber potential in the deep bayou. It was a god-forsaken place, accessible only by a narrow gauge rail and then a flat-bottom boat. Miles of cypress trees rising out of black water, draped in Spanish moss like old rags. I arrived at the outpost, a miserable collection of shacks on stilts. I was to stay with the senior foreman, a man named Arthur Miller. He was a tall, gaunt fellow from Kentucky, pale as a sheet despite the sun. He welcomed me, but there was a pity in his eyes I didn't understand. On my 3rd morning there, Miller sat me down on the porch. The air was already heavy with humidity, the mosquitoes buzzing like buzzsaws. "Thorne," he said, looking grave, "you shouldn't have come here. Not now." I laughed. "Why? The company pays well." "It ain't about the money, son," Miller said, packing his pipe with shaking hands. "It's the season. The blackwater fever is rampant. The swamp is breathing it out. Your fresh meat, new blood from the city, always gets hit the hardest. Once that fever takes hold, it turns your blood to sludge. There's no doctor for 50 miles that can save you. I asked him why he stayed if it was so deadly. Miller looked out at the dark, stagnant water. I got nowhere else to go. The depression hit my family hard. I buried 2 daughters out back last year. Same fever. But you still have a chance. Boil your water. Don't go out at night. But honestly, it probably won't matter. I was young and arrogant. I brushed off his warnings as the ramblings of a broken old man. I threw myself into the work. Despite the danger, the bayou was hauntingly beautiful. The way the sun cut through the canopy, the explosion of wildflowers, the strange, colorful birds. It was a paradise if you ignored the rot underneath. Miller eventually found me a place of my own, a raised cabin on cypress pilings, about a mile from the main camp. It was sturdy, with cedar plank floors and wide windows to catch the breeze. I felt safe there. I even hired a local Cajun man named Remy to help with the cooking and cleaning. Remy was a quiet soul, superstitious, always wearing charms made of alligator teeth, but he made a damn good gumbo. 2 months passed without incident. I began to think Miller was just trying to scare me. Then came the day I had to inspect a logging site at Dead Man's Bend, about 10 miles upriver. It was a rough trip. The heat was oppressive, sticking to my skin like wet wool. By the time I reached the trading post at the bend, a shady operation run by 2 brothers named Vance, I wasn't feeling right. The Vance brothers dealt in moonshine and illegal furs. While I was checking their timber logs, a sudden wave of dizziness hit me. The world tilted on its axis. My head started throbbing like a drum. One of the brothers, a grease-stained man named Earl, saw me stumble. He handed me a dirty glass of some herbal concoction. "Drink this, city boy," he sneered. "Looks like the swamp got ya." "Is it the fever?" I asked, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "Black water kills plenty," Earl said casually, spitting tobacco juice onto the floor. "New folks drop like flies. We've been here long enough to pickle ourselves against it. You? Not so much." Panic started to set in. I couldn't finish the inspection. I stumbled back to my skiff, barely conscious. The journey back to my cabin is a blur of green leaves and dark water. By the time I dragged myself up the stairs to my cabin, I was burning up. The fever had claws. Miller came running when Remy sent word. They packed me in ice, forced quinine down my throat. For 3 days, I lived in a hallucination. Then, the fever broke. Everyone told me I was lucky, that it was just a touch of heat stroke. I wanted to believe them. I went back to work after a week, feeling weak but steady. But the swamp was just playing with me. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in the sheriff's office in the nearby parish town, going over maps, when it hit me again. Harder this time. The sheriff, a stout man named Beauchamp, took one look at me and ordered his deputy to take me home. "Get him to bed," he said. "He looks like death warmed over." This time, the fever played a cruel game. It would come like a tsunami, drowning me in fire and delirium, and then vanish, leaving me cold and hollow. It happened 3 times. By the 3rd relapse, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was just tired. The specific symptoms of blackwater fever, the dark urine, the jaundice, the unstoppable shivering set in. I was bleeding internally. I knew what this meant. I lay in that cabin for days. On the 3rd morning of the latest bout, Miller and Sheriff Beauchamp came to see me. Remy offered them coffee, but they refused. They stood at the foot of my bed, hats in their hands, looking like undertakers. "Elias," the sheriff said, shifting uncomfortably, "you need to leave. If you can move, you need to get on the train back to New Orleans." "Why?" I whispered. "The doctor didn't say anything." "The doctor told us," Miller interrupted, his voice cracking. "He didn't have the heart to tell you. He says you aren't going to make it. Not through another night like this. He says your kidneys are failing. We thought you should know. Go home, son. Die in your own bed." The words hung in the humid air. Die. "How can I go?" I asked, a strange calmness washing over me. "I can't even walk to the door." "We have a stretcher coming," the sheriff said. "We'll get some boys from the camp. A deputy will ride with you to the station. We won't leave you until you're on that train." I nodded. I accepted it. I didn't know then that it was already too late to leave. It was 9 in the morning. I told Remy to heat some water so I could wash up, try to look decent for my final journey. I ate a few spoonfuls of grits, feeling the energy drain out of me with every swallow. Around noon, the men arrived with the stretcher, and that, Elias paused, taking a long sip of his bourbon, is where the story actually begins, or ends, depending on how you look at it. "Why?" Dawson asked, his skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. "You said you recovered. You're sitting here." "I recovered," Elias said, his eyes darkening, "but not because of the doctor, and not because of the medicine. The doctor had given me up. He gave me that food not to cure me, but as a last kindness to a dying man. I realized that later." "So, what happened?" I asked. "The stretcher arrived," Elias continued. "Miller and the sheriff were waiting on the porch. Remy was packing my trunk. I tried to stand up to help, and that's when the darkness took me. A violent rigor seized my body. My teeth chattered so hard I thought they would crack. I collapsed onto the floor. I couldn't make it to the stretcher. I couldn't make it to the train. The world dissolved into a thick, suffocating black velvet. I was conscious, but paralyzed. I heard voices, distant and muffled, like they were underwater. Then, silence. Absolute, terrifying silence. When my mind started to clear, I realized I was still in my room, but it was pitch black. No lamps were lit. Had they left me? Was I dead? I tried to call out for Remy. "Remy!" I croaked, but no sound came out. My throat was paralyzed. I looked around. Through the window, I could see the silhouette of a cypress branch swaying in the wind, backlit by the moonlight. My trunk was packed by the wall. My umbrella was leaning in the corner. I hadn't moved an inch. Panic began to rise, cold and sharp. I was alone, abandoned in a cabin in the middle of the swamp, dying of fever. The silence was heavy, almost physical. And then I saw it. Outside the window, in the pale moonlight, something moved. Not a branch, not an animal. It was a figure, a young woman, dark as the night itself. She was moving with incredible speed, circling my cabin. Round and round she went, dragging a stick through the mud, carving a line in the earth. She passed my door once, twice. On the third time, she stopped. She crouched low and looked directly through the cracks in the wooden wall. Her eyes met mine. She raised a hand, palm open, and I heard her voice, not in my ears, but inside my head, clear as a bell. The voice wasn't loud, but it resonated in my bones, drowning out the cicadas and the distant rumble of thunder. "Don't be afraid," she whispered. "I am drawing the line. Tonight, nothing can cross it. Nothing can touch you. Sleep. Just sleep." I lay there, paralyzed, my eyes tracking her movement through the gaps in the cypress planks. She was young, no more than 18, with wild, dark hair that clung to her face. But what struck me most was her physical state. She was drenched. Sweat poured off her skin as if she were running a marathon in a furnace. Her dress was soaked through, clinging to her trembling frame. It looked as though she was wrestling with something invisible, something heavy and terrible. She moved with a frantic, jerky rhythm, circling the cabin again. I saw her stoop down, her hand pressing that stick into the muck, carving a deep groove into the earth surrounding my stilts. It wasn't just a line. It felt like a wall being erected, brick by invisible brick. Every time she passed my line of sight, she would pause, look up at me with eyes that held an infinite, ancient sadness, and mouth the words again. "Sleep. You are safe." The last thing I remember was her face, illuminated by a flash of lightning, shining with perspiration and fierce determination. And then, my gaze drifted to that cypress branch swaying outside the window, its Spanish moss hanging like a ragged beard. The rhythm of its swaying matched the beating of my heart, slower and slower, until the darkness wasn't terrifying anymore. It was a blanket, and for the first time in weeks, I slept. Not the fever dream delirium, but a deep, dreamless slumber. I don't know how long I was out, but when I opened my eyes, the quality of the light had changed. It was morning, a bright, sharp morning. The storm had passed. The air coming through the window smelled of wet earth and ozone, clean and new. I lay there for a moment, waiting for the shivering to start, waiting for the nausea to roll over me. But it didn't come. My body felt incredibly heavy, like lead, but the fire in my veins was gone. My head was clear. The pounding drums behind my eyes had silenced. I tried to sit up, but found I was too weak to lift my head more than an inch. I turned my gaze toward the door. It was slightly ajar. Through the crack, I saw a shadow hesitate. It was Remy, my Cajun helper. He was tiptoeing, moving with the exaggerated caution of a man entering a tomb. He peeked around the doorframe, his eyes wide, clutching his alligator tooth charm so hard his knuckles were white. When he saw my eyes open, he jumped back as if he'd seen a ghost. He didn't speak. He just stared, his mouth hanging open. "Remy," I rasped. My voice was a dry croak. "Get Miller." Remy didn't answer. He backed away, stumbling over his own feet, and then I heard his boots thudding down the wooden stairs. He ran like the devil was snapping at his heels. I lay there, confused. Why was he so terrified? I was weak, yes, but I was alive. I managed to turn my head to the side and saw a pitcher of water on the nightstand. With a monumental effort, I reached out, my hand trembling, and knocked it over. Fortunately, a tin cup was nearby. I managed to scoop up a mouthful of spilled water from the oilcloth table cover. It was warm and stale, but it tasted like nectar. About 20 minutes later, I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. A crowd was coming up. The door swung open, and there stood Miller, Sheriff Beauchamp, and the camp doctor, a weary man named Dr. Landry. Behind them, a few roughnecks from the timber crew peered in. Miller's face was a mask of disbelief. He took off his hat, crumpling the brim in his hands. "Thorne?" he whispered. You're awake?" "I'm hungry, Miller," I said, finding a bit more strength. "Is there any barley or grits?" Miller turned to the doctor, his eyes wide. He whispered something frantic to Dr. Landry, then turned back to Remy, who was hovering in the hallway. "Go! Get the man some barley water! Now!" Dr. Landry approached the bed cautiously. He placed a hand on my forehead, checked my pulse, and then pulled back my eyelids. He let out a long, shaky breath. "The fever," he muttered, looking at the sheriff. "It's broken. Completely broke. His temperature is normal." "How is that possible?" the sheriff asked, looking at me with a mixture of awe and suspicion. "Last night, he was practically a corpse." "I don't know," the doctor admitted, shaking his head. "I've seen Blackwater take men in half the time. This is a miracle. There's no medical explanation for it." Remy returned with a bowl of warm barley broth. Miller fed me spoonful by spoonful, his hands shaking slightly. As the nourishment hit my stomach, I felt a flicker of life return. I rested for an hour, then ate a little boiled rice in the afternoon. By the next day, I was sitting up. By the third day, I was walking to the porch. It was only then, as I sat on the porch watching the sun set over the bayou, that the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. I began to ask questions, and the answers chilled me more than the fever ever did. Miller sat beside me, looking at the floorboards. "Elias," he said quietly, "you have to understand. We didn't leave you out of malice. We left because, well, down here, there are rules." "What are you talking about?" I asked. That night, Miller confessed, when the rigor set in and you collapsed, we couldn't find a pulse. You were cold. Your breathing was so shallow, it didn't fog a mirror. The doctor said you wouldn't last the hour. He said the fever was contagious in its final stage, that the bad air would kill anyone in the room with you. He paused, taking a swig from his flask. We made arrangements, son. We really did. We had the coffin built. We couldn't get you to the train station in the storm, so we planned to bury you on the rise come morning. The sheriff, he even sent a telegram. I stared at him. A telegram? To your family in New Orleans? Miller nodded grimly, informing them of your passing. We expected to find a body this morning. That's why Remy was so scared. He wasn't coming to check on a patient. He was coming to prepare a corpse. I sat there in silence, the horror of it washing over me. They had abandoned me. In my darkest hour, when I lay dying on the floor, they had all walked away. The civilized men, the doctor, the sheriff, my friends. They had fled the sickness and left me to face the dark alone. But I hadn't been alone. I looked out at the muddy ground surrounding my cabin. The heavy rains from the storm had washed away most of the tracks, but in the fading light, I could still see a faint, circular depression in the mud. A perfect circle, unbroken, encompassing the entire structure. Miller, I asked, my voice steady. Who stayed? What do you mean? If you all left, who stayed with me? Who watched over me all night? Who walked around the house in the rain? Miller looked at me like I was crazy. Nobody, Elias. We locked the door. Nobody would dare come out here in that storm. Especially not to a house with blackwater fever. The locals, they're terrified of it. They think it's a curse. I didn't say anything. I knew what I had seen. I knew whose voice I had heard. If the living had abandoned me, then who or what had saved me? Miller looked at me like I was speaking in tongues. He shook his head slowly, a pitying look returning to his eyes. Elias, listen to me. That was the fever talking. You were hallucinating. No one, not a soul, goes out into the swamp in a hurricane, and certainly not to the house of a dying man. The locals, the Cajuns, and the workers, they were terrified. They believe Blackwater is a curse from God. They were miles away, hiding in their shacks. I didn't argue. There was no point in arguing with a man who dealt only in timber yields and payrolls. But I knew what I had seen. And suddenly, a realization hit me like a physical blow. I remembered the girl's face. I remembered the sweat beading on her forehead, the way her clothes were drenched. It wasn't rain, and it wasn't from the exertion of running. She was sweating because she was burning up. She hadn't just drawn a line in the mud. She had taken the fire from my blood and pulled it into her own. She had absorbed the death that was meant for me. The recovery was slow but steady. Dr. Landry called it a medical miracle, a case for the textbooks. But Remy, my Cajun helper, looked at me with different eyes. He treated me with a strange reverence, as if I had returned from the other side. A few days later, while I was sitting on the porch sipping broth, Remy approached me. He was twisting his hat in his hands, looking nervous. "Monsieur Thorne," he whispered, glancing around to make sure Miller wasn't within earshot. "Mr. Miller says you saw someone that night. A girl?" I nodded. "Yes, Remy. Do you know anyone like that? Young, maybe 18, thin, large dark eyes?" Remy clutched the wooden cross around his neck. Did she draw on the ground? A mark?" "Yes," I said, surprised. "She drew a circle around the cabin." Remy closed his eyes and muttered a quick prayer in French Creole. When he looked back at me, his face was pale. "You are marked, monsieur. The old folks in the bayou, they tell stories. They speak of le traiteur fantôme, the ghost healer. They say 50 years ago, there was a girl in the parish. She had the gift. She died saving her village from the yellow fever, taking all the sickness onto herself until her heart gave out." He paused, lowering his voice to a hush. "They say she never left. When the storm is high and death is standing on the porch, sometimes she comes back. She draws the line that death cannot cross. You saw her, monsieur. You saw the guardian." A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the fever. I was a surveyor, a man of maps and logic. But looking out at that primeval swamp, with its hanging moss and dark secrets, I realized that science didn't have a map for everything. I stayed in that region for another 2 years to finish my contract. Miller urged me to move to a better house near the main settlement, but I refused. I stayed in that cabin on stilts. Strange as it sounds, that house felt like the safest place on earth. The invisible circle she had drawn that night felt like a fortress of iron. I never had a touch of fever again. I spent many moonless nights sitting by the window, watching the cypress trees, hoping to thank her. But I never saw her again. When my time was finally up, I packed my bags to return to New Orleans. Miller came to see me off at the train station. He looked older, more worn down by the swamp than I was. As the train whistled in the distance, he gripped my hand. "Thorne," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know, that night haunts me. We left you for dead. We abandoned you. That guilt, it's a heavy thing to carry." I smiled, feeling a strange sense of peace. "You didn't kill me, Miller. You were just men. Men get scared. Men run. But the one who stayed, she was something else entirely." Elias Thorne drained the last drop of his bourbon. The ice clinked against the glass, the only sound in the silent tavern. The storm outside had settled into a steady rhythmic rain. We all sat there, spellbound. Dawson, the young skeptic who had mocked Elias earlier, was staring at the old surveyor with his mouth slightly open, his cynicism completely washed away. Elias stood up. He was an old man now, his joints stiff, but he stood tall. He put his hat back on, casting a shadow over his eyes.
You might think, Elias said softly, that this is just a tall tale from a senile old man. A fever dream. Maybe it was. Maybe there was no girl. Maybe it was just my own will to live, fighting back the darkness. He walked toward the door, his limp pronounced. Hand on the latch, he turned back to us one last time. But does it matter? The doctor had signed my death warrant. The grave was dug. My family had the telegram. And yet, here I am, 50 years later, drinking bourbon with you fine gentlemen. He opened the door, and the wind swirled in, carrying the scent of the river. Life is a strange business, Elias said, his voice blending with the night. When the world turns its back on you, when even your friends leave you to the dark, remember this: you are never truly alone. There is always something watching, something that draws the line. With that, Elias Thorne stepped out into the rainy night. The door swung shut behind him. We sat in the dim light of the rusty anchor, listening to the rain, none of us willing to break the silence. The ghost story was over, but the feeling it left behind, that strange mixture of fear and hope, hung in the air long after the old man had gone.